Hi there and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. This is the Ukraine update, the fourth of these that I've done, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about what seems to be happening across really the Western world, Britain, America, Europe, when it comes to Britain, the sort of the West's kind of divided political tribes and their approach to both Russia and Ukraine. There seems to be a kind of determined holdout by the admirers of Putin, who we'll come to at the moment, to try to continue to fight Putin's corner, and a rather over-enthusiastic embrace of the Zelenskiy regime by Western liberal commentators who perhaps don't know quite as much about Zelenskiy and his backers as they might think they do. So to begin with, let's look at Western support, or for this kind of Western support for Putin. Now, there is an awful lot written about the kind of the murky financial dealings between the Russian Federation and the things like the Trump Organization and the Brexit movement in Britain. I don't profess really to know enough about these matters. There were issues like the Steele dossier, which suggested that there was compromise on Trump. There has been all sorts of discussion about the Brexit campaign and where it was funded from, and the kind of various flows of dark money that went into the campaign, which seem to have come from a variety of sources, not merely just Russia. It's difficult to assess, really, even if there were flows of dark money into the Brexit campaign, the extent to which that was the decisive factor. The role of Britain's newspapers, and also the kind of the social and political crisis that the country was plunged into over the previous 6 years before the Brexit campaign, namely austerity, which people on the left rightly point out had a huge effect on kind of coarsening public attitudes towards immigration, to making essentially Britain a kind of a harder, angrier, more brutal country, from a sort of a brutalised population who had many of whom either endured austerity, or they are the people that rather approved of it, and thought that this was a kind of like a good thing to do to the poor and the desperate of the country in order to kind of improve their moral fibre in some fashion. So it's a difficult and a very fraught kind of political landscape to look at when we look at Russian funding of the European kind of conservative right, populist right, alt-right, and in cases far right. But it seems to be beyond doubt that European right-wing parties and far-right parties in places like Italy, Hungary, Great Britain, and other kind of key target countries, monies have been received, and these have paid for kind of a favourable hearing for Russia. And even if monies haven't been transmitted, what Russia represents, or what the Putin regime represents to Western reactionaries, is something that they would ideally like to see replicated in their own countries. Here you have a regime that explicitly has said to the Russian man, we will put you back in charge, we will erode women's rights, we will erode gay and lesbian rights. This is the Russian heterosexual man, obviously. And the things that, such as the decriminalisation of domestic violence is a key example. We will uphold this kind of patriarchal, authoritarian vision of masculinity. Well, this is very much catnip to the International AltRight, which is organised around ideas about kind of a cultural ideas around chauvinism. The thing that the American alt-right and its British and European and Russian variations have in common is this attempt to create culture wars, to whip up kind of anger and confusion about things like trans rights or the Black Lives Matter movement. I can't imagine the Putin regime cares one way or another about whether black Americans are treated with dignity and respect. And the weaponization of outlets like media outlets like Sputnik and Russia Today to create eyeballs and to attract eyeballs to its media and to create lots and lots of kind of anger and controversy, and by presenting all manner of kind of contrarian perspectives, is then followed by by an organised attempt to present a Russian-friendly perspective in the world. Where is the harm in that? You say, do state medias around the world do this? Yes, of course they do. Even things that aren't considered state media in Great Britain, like the BBC. Well, I mean, the BBC doesn't quite court controversy in that way, but it presents a kind of, it is a key part of British soft power, and has been used thusly time and time again. I suppose the issue is that the weaponization of cultural and social debates. I mean, in Britain, the classic example is, of course, Brexit. Serves Russian long-term foreign policy objectives. And as has often been said, events like Brexit served Vladimir Putin very, very well. I think in a way, once again with Brexit, it's possible to overstate Russian influence. It seems to have been kind of largely a self-inflicted disaster, that Russia used the old kind of Napoleonic dictum of never interrupt one's enemies when they are making a mistake. Anyway, at the moment, if one looks at the output of things like Fox News, individuals like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity on Fox News, who during the Trump era, because Trump was explicitly pro-Putin and believed that not only Putin was a model for how kind of a Trumpist America could look, which as a kind of like a level of kind of naivety and foolishness, and also kind of unrealistic projection, that there isn't much to rival it, and the idea that America's political and defence establishment would ultimately allow that in the long run is fanciful. But people like Carlson and Hannity were not only espousing this kind of Trumpist line of being kind of sympathetic to Russia and to Russian interests, but also they were reiterating an explicitly Russian line about Russian and opposition towards and antipathy towards the kind of cultural politics that Fox News hates anyway. Both of them, since the Ukrainian invasion, have become slightly more muted, slightly more circumspect, because the images of atrocities can't easily be wished away and can't easily be ignored. They become slightly more circumspect, but gradually they are introducing these sorts of pro-Putin talking points, in a way because they're pro-Trump talking points. The idea that this happens to have happened on Biden's watch, and without with Trump's involvement, Trump making one of his wonderful boardroom style deals, none of this would have happened. Trump, of course, famously tried to extort the Zelensky regime into providing dirt on Hunter Biden in return for arms. These arms, as we can see now, are very, very useful. So this is perhaps setting up, and I think this is probably, hopefully unrealistic, but you never know. This is attempting to set up a kind of a foreign policy platform for Trump to campaign on, to get the Republican nomination for 2024 and to campaign against Biden on in 2024. Again, I'm not entirely sure, given the state of Trump's legal problems and his gradual diminishment, his sort of banishment from Twitter, and his gradual diminishment within Republican circles, whether that's even possible. But, we were wrong the first time, weren't we? In Great Britain, the voices who are cheerleading Vladimir Putin are far more marginal. Great Britain hasn't really got. It has GB News, but GB News is as nothing compared to the scale and the power of Fox News in the USA, and those figures that make a kind of a good sort of showing for Putin are far more marginal. Even characters like Nigel Farage, who it was at the kind of the pinnacle of his power and influence during the Brexit campaign, are now looking more and more marginal. So the moment at which they finally abandon pro-Putin rhetoric will be interesting. Perhaps they won't. Perhaps people like Farage and Carlson and Hannity will continue. They will double down on Putin support. But it's difficult for, particularly for Britain's right-wing establishment, to completely abandon the idea of Putin, partly because of everything that has been said in the past, and also the suspicion that there have been these connections between things like the Brexit campaign and Russia's oligarchs. The Conservative Party that has been highly kind of obstructionist in a way to efforts to undermine Putin through sanctions against oligarchs, whilst in fairness at the same time arming Ukraine to the teeth, and British shoulder-launched missiles, Javelin missiles, have been decimating Russian tanks. The extent to which the Conservative Party is wallowing in dark Russian money it is quite extraordinary. It's quite historically unprecedented. There is, to my knowledge, even when in the 1970s, when large amounts of Saudi cash was circulating around London, there is, to my knowledge, nothing like this in modern British history. The kind of the depth and the penetration of Russian oligarchic money. And that helps us to kind of understand some of the other kind of dynamics at play in modern Britain. When you have a party that is owned by oligarchs who are whose money is offshored and largely plundered from Russia, and funded by elites from the City of London, funded by people who have parked their cash in the Cayman Islands for a long, long time. They're able to purchase the party in a way that previous generations, small and medium level businessmen, car showroom owners, people who owned properties in rental properties across urban Britain, people who owned kind of manufacturing or quarrying or mining or those sorts of kind of enterprises. Those kinds of kind of small to medium-sized industrialists that used to make up the kind of the base of the Conservative Party, their money doesn't talk anymore. Oligarchic money does. The kind of money that you have to go and visit someone on a big yacht in order to get your hands on. That money talks, and it's not all Russian by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of it is. And so this is when you can understand that a kind of a money that thrives on chaos, that thrives on taking bets against currencies and that kind of thing. The money of people like Crispin O'Day, who backed Brexit and thought this was made, I think it was £200 million in one currency bet on the night of Brexit. That sort of money is the kind of money that leads to people like Boris Johnson, who famously said, and if you'll pardon the language, fuck business when it came to Brexit. It's a sort of money that doesn't really mind if British living standards collapse. It doesn't really mind if Britain becomes a sort of like a second wheel to Europe, because it's not money that's located here. It's money that drifts around the world, and money that is has no vested interest in long-term British stability or prosperity. So that's the money that owns the Conservative Party for the most part. The extent of its penetration into the Labour Party, well, perhaps greatly lessened, but maybe the Labour Party will become a more attractive destination for it if the Conservative Party's fortunes dwindle. Okay, so let's talk about Zelensky and Zelenskyy's appeal in Western media, particularly. Understandably, there are enormous Western sympathies towards Ukraine for the most part. Those people I've just talked about, the Farages, etc., who have made, at least conciliatory comments about, or mitigatory sort of comments about Russia, those folks are by and large not being listened to in the main, and the outpouring of support for Ukraine from most people has been quite commendable. The knowledge that most Western commentators have about Vladimir Zelensky is pretty slender, and the kind of the understanding of the events from the Maidan revolution of 2014 all the way up to the present day, again, is pretty slender, and that's understandable, and I think no one can be really criticised for that. But there is an immense naivety at play at the moment. when last week Will Smith famously slapped some other Chris Rock, I think it was, in the face in a sort of like a media hoo-ha, there were comments from various sort of kind of high-profile liberal celebrities for the most part saying one should be more like Zelensky and less like Will Smith. Does anybody really know anything about Zelensky? I mean, the outlawing of 11 opposition parties would tend to point towards the fact that our binary view of this matter, which is something that again, international onlookers invariably create this idea that we have to have good guys and bad guys, not very bad guys and not so bad guys or questionable guys. That's a kind of a story that's harder for us to grapple with, and the reality will inevitably be that we're talking about a nationalist leader of Ukraine who has every right to demand that his country be armed, and every right to demand that Europeans and America and the international community does its bit to hold the line against Russia. But his own use of kind of offshore tax havens and questionable financial issues, again, suggests that we're not dealing with a kind of an entirely angelic character here, and it would be naive to assume that we are. There are all sorts of third world, for example, during the Cold War era, third world national liberation leaders who can't be described as particularly benign individuals. And it's a kind of a Western naivety to assume that they are, or they should be, these are sort of historical actors, people who fought often bloody and quite morally compromised wars against aggressors. And so this isn't to say that Zelensky shouldn't have the support of the West, but it's to say that we should not go about looking at Zelensky through rose-tinted spectacles. Here are some thoughts to consider. If in some series of unlikely events Russia is completely routed and leaves all of the areas annexed from Ukraine, how will the Russian ethnic minority in places like Crimea be treated? How will the Russian ethnic minorities be accommodated within a reunified Ukraine? Or will they be allowed to? Will they be forced to leave? Will they be killed? Will they be persecuted? History tells us that it's more likely they will than they won't. And what will Zelensky's response to that then be? In this kind of future counterfactual situation. If Zelensky survives all of this and manages to make a deal with Russia, it will inevitably be a deal. It will inevitably be the best deal he can make, and it'll be a confused and compromised one, no doubt, that will leave large numbers of people in Ukraine probably unhappy, and he will have to preside over the best of a bad situation. So it's important for onlookers, international onlookers, to look as a realistic a manner as possible at the actors we've got in front of us. A part of the problem that we've created for ourselves with Putin is this narrative that we're dealing essentially with some kind of Blofeld style Bond villain, this icy genius that understands everything and is manipulating the world. I'm sure that is something that is actively created by Putin as well, but again, evidently it's not true. The kind of the muddled chaos and incompetence that has really marked the Ukraine invasion so far would suggest that it's not true, and it would also suggest something rather fundamental about Russia's capacity to wage wars Russia is normally good at waging wars against civilian populations and has done so since 1956 onwards. And its last active hot war waged in Afghanistan, it lost. So, other than the fact that it is a nuclear armed power, we have to be more circumspect and look at the evidence presented to us regarding Russia. But we have to do the same with Ukraine as well. Anyway, I'll keep you posted on the next Ukraine update, and there'll be a regular episode of the Explaining History podcast coming later in the week. Thanks very much, everybody. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.